Story 1. I am at the age where I am technically considered an adult but have not yet figured out how to be one. Story 2. See-through plastic phones and toys were very popular when I was a child. Story 3. On my walk home from school in 3rd grade, I was constantly scouting places to hide in case I saw an atomic bomb flash. Story 4. Mature enough to understand the consequences but still foolish enough to ignore them sometimes. Story 5. I remember the formation of the 7 Seas, and I wrestled a Tyrannosaurus on a dare. Story 6. I make a funny noise now sometimes when I get up. People find it weird that I do not have children, but fewer and fewer dare to ask when I will have them with each year that passes. I have a small collection of gray hairs. I remember the noise of dial-up, but my floppy disks were always rigid. I was born in the year of the snake. Story 7. Finally understood how to do my taxes. My back and knees are starting to hurt. I do not find clubbing or raves appealing. Having a 3rd beer is definitely something to think about before committing. Story 8. I have witnessed the seasons change again and again. While I have yet to see Saturn complete a full orbit from Earth's perspective, I have spun around the sun enough times to know the rhythm of its cycles and the warmth of its light. My path has taken me, past countless sunsets and sunrises, through the waxing and waning of moons, and along the silent, steady orbits of planets that keep time for the cosmos. I am still young enough to explore new worlds, yet seasoned enough to understand the gravity of life's lessons. Story 9. My back hurts, but my hair has not started going gray yet. Story 10. If we were in 10,000 before Christ, I would be dead. If we were in 4,000 before Christ, I would be a tribal elder. As we are in 2025 Anno Domini, I am eating too much avocado toast, and that is why I cannot buy a house. Story 11. I was born long ago, when Blockbuster was still in its prime and Family Guy had just released a new season. Story 12. I would say something like old enough to know better, young enough to still try anyway. How would you describe yours? Story 13. I have had enough birthdays to stop counting and just enjoy the cake. Story 14. I have used a rotary phone, but I can still save portable document format files and email them. Story 15. I am always tired. Everything hurts. I dislike loud noises. I drive home from work without playing music. The new generation is disappointing. I read the news every day and call every politician an idiot. Story 16. That's a very interesting question. People often think they have reached a certain stage in life just because they have lived a number of years. Here is how I would describe my age. I have lived long enough to see one of my parents die. I have had multiple serious romantic relationships. I am an expert at the job I do, and I could continue. However, I could be 25 or 65. Age is just a number in most cases. Someone could have had half the experiences I have and be twice as old, or have twice my experience and be younger. Story 17. I have lived long enough to see my childhood toys become collectibles. Story 18. As old as my tongue, a little older than my teeth. Story 19. I got very excited about choosing airtight containers for food in my new kitchen. Story 20. Old enough to serve in the military but not old enough to drink alcohol. Story 21. Old enough that I do not want to deal with it, but young enough that I have to. Story 22. Supposed to be an experienced adult by now but still feel beyond lost. Story 23. Recently graduated from university but still feel like a child. Story 24. January 26th was officially recognized as a national public holiday for the first time. Story 25. Old enough to have children in high school today. I am old but still young enough for elderly people to say I am young. Story 26. Too young to have met the dinosaurs, but old enough to recall when England was young and knights were brave and bold. Story 27. Too old to be relevant and cool but too young to be considered an old head. Story 28. I am old enough to have joint pain for no obvious reason. Story 29. Old enough to know what I am doing. Young enough to have missed out on learning what that was. Story 30. I have lived over half the life I want to live. Now, be quiet and end my suffering before it worsens. Story 31. At a stage where I have made enough mistakes to learn from them but am still curious and foolish enough to make new ones. Story 32. I was born in the year when people thought the world would end. Story 33. Old enough to know better, young enough to still ruin your life for fun. Story 34. I have been all the way around the sun again and again. Story 35. The age of contentment is the time between children leaving the nest and becoming self-sufficient, and the body beginning to show signs of aging. Story 36. I am at an age where I feel young mentally and not old. However, I am aging and have already taken on family responsibilities. Story 37. I used a silver Motorola Razr as my second cell phone. Story 38. Old enough to be your father, to anyone who looks under 25. Story 39. I remember Betamax lost. There was only one shelf in the entire store, while the rest was VHS. Story 40. Old enough to know better, old enough not to care. Proud member of the We Do Not Care Club. Story 41. Old enough to have white in my beard, young enough to compete in sports. Story 42. Words like newborn, infant, toddler, teenager, middle-aged, senior. Story 43. I am old enough to remember having to rewind video home system tapes, but young enough that I still get excited when my phone battery lasts all day, which puts me in that sweet spot of technological nostalgia with modern anxiety. Story 44. Old enough to put tape on my cassettes so I could overwrite them with recordings from Much Music Canada. Young enough to be at the rail at a sold-out show, getting sprayed with flying beer cans and the occasional foot to the head from crowd surfers. Story 45. I am the size of a child with the trauma of a teenager and young adult, but I still act very childish. Story 46. I was born the day that Patrick Sherrill shot up the Edmond post office, which inspired the term going postal. Story 47. The Avatar already injured my knees and took away their bending ability. Story 48. Barely old enough to drink legally in the United States, but old enough to have voted in 2 presidential elections. Story 49. I would say I am old enough to know better but still young enough to try anyway. Story 50. I watched the Berlin Wall come down live on television while I was doing homework for high school. That shows how old I am. Story 51. Young enough to do foolish things, smart enough to know better. Story 52. In medieval times, I would be dead by now and have 3 children half my age. Story 53. I am 30 years old now and was born in February, counting 366 months plus the 9 months I was in my mother's womb. I am a total of 375 months old. Story 54. Old enough to be bald with sore ankles. Young enough to keep calling everyone dude. Story 55. I have heard that Epstein did not kill himself. I have seen the towers collapse on television. I did not see the Berlin Wall come down, but I was born in the happy spring when the Soviet Union dissolved. Story 56. I remember when theropod dinosaurs were depicted upright. Story 57. By naming a significant event that occurred around the time I was born. Story 58. I was the first female to do my job in the United States Navy. President Dwight D. Eisenhower was in office when I was born. Story 59. If counting years is still allowed, I would count years of experience. Most people have about a decade and a half of education experience by default, with some adding several more years on top of that. I also had some entry-level job experience working in retail and customer service. After that, I gained several years of corporate white-collar work experience. My background could be described as a college-educated worker with a few years of commercial experience and several years of white-collar experience. This provides an estimate of my age while giving insight into the types of life experience I have had. Story 60. I have experienced many springs, summers, autumns, and winters. I am merely a human, not a child nor an old man. Still, the times of prime are far behind, and yet I prevail. Story 61. The answer to the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything. Story 62. When I was a child, the internet was almost entirely text-based. Story 63. Without numbers, you cannot tell time, and there would be no concept of age. Story 64. Not old enough to be your father, but old enough to annoy your father. Story 65. I am at the stage of life where I have learned some hard lessons, remain curious about everything, and am finally comfortable saying no without guilt. Story 66. I point to Logan's Run and say the hunters are still looking for me. Story 67. Almost not a teenager anymore. It better be just as good as you all promised. Story 68. Hit by a quarter-life crisis even before reaching a quarter of my life. Story 69. I do not know how you could define age without the existence of quantity. Story 70. A month ago, I was not able to buy everything at a gas station, and now I can. Story 71. Old enough to have lived through several once-in-a-lifetime economic crashes and many once-in-a-lifetime hurricanes. Story 72. Not as young as I could be, but not as old as you might think. Story 73. I would describe my age as a spry tennis ball lodged in the throat of an ancient and recently awoken 10-story Godzilla-style monster that had been terrorizing a sparsely populated archipelago in the Pacific, now drowning face down in a watery slurry of sand, salt water, and irony. Admittedly, I am not always great at describing things. I reckon this is one such time. Story 74. Everything hurts. Food does not taste as good as it used to. Welcoming sweet release. Story 75. Old enough that you grunt when sitting down and getting up, and little inane things start to cause back problems but still able to be active. Story 76. I would just tell people my eyes have recently stopped working. I am sore every day even though I did not do anything, and I have bruises I cannot explain. Story 77. Going back many years, in a slightly politically and socially incorrect time, my partner said, I am as old as the person I feel. Story 78. Probably in the autumn of my life and hoping for a late winter. Story 79. That feeling when you do not know what to do and everything has just started. Story 80. As a child, my favorite cartoon was Captain Planet. I played Pokemon Blue on an original Game Boy. Welcome to America Online. Story 81. As a preteen, I witnessed a plane going into the World Trade Center on live television. Also, my back hurts. Story 82. I am firmly in the creaky years but not yet in the wheezy years. Story 83. Old enough that my back hurts, young enough to do something about it, and too young to ignore it now. Story 84. If you could not count, then you would not be an intelligent enough life form for it to matter. Story 85. Today is my birthday. I would say that today I am entering the era of onset painful weakness in my body, particularly my back and knees, and the mental realization that I have wasted some of my youth. Story 86. Young people think I am old. Old people think I am young. Story 87. I am in the middle of an age that nobody cares about. Story 88. Old enough to be alive during peak dial-up but with limited memory of actually using it beyond early childhood. Story 89. If numbers did not exist, we would not have figured out computers, and thus I cannot use any real history to determine my age. Therefore, I must say, slightly balding, but not enough to worry about shaving it all off. My skin is not wrinkly, but it is definitely starting to show a little change since my younger years. My knees and back always hurt somewhat. Half my life ago, I could recollect pretty much anything I was thinking if I forgot. I have now reached the point where it is so common not to be able to recollect that it does not even bother me anymore. Story 90. Old enough to regret the naps I refused to take as a child. Story 91. I am at the age where I need my sleep, and I do not want conflict. Story 92. I have long since stopped growing, but have not begun getting old. Story 93. Oh, if we are going to complicate it, then I need to know who is asking my age because I can complicate it further. Story 94. This sounds like the sort of annoying icebreaker question you might get asked in a corporate team building session your employer spent £10,000 on. Story 95. I am going to assume we are not in a very advanced society without numbers. I am 28, which is probably considered late age for that time. Story 96. I graduated high school the spring before the end of the Mayan calendar in 2012. Story 97. Some grays. Still hot and strong. Calm. Cannot remember names. Story 98. Old enough to know better. Young enough not to care. Too old to make it happen properly. Story 99. Too old for this nonsense. Young enough to still work for the world to be better. Story 100. I do not like girls or boys who are preteens. Why is their hair? This is due to entering puberty. My arms and legs feel funny in mid-puberty. I can reach the tall shelf in late puberty or late teens. I am old enough to be tried as an adult but not allowed to drink, in the late teens to early 20s. It did not used to hurt doing this, but now there is new pain unlocked in everything else. Story 101. Old enough to have a young child. Old enough to have an adult child if I made poor decisions. Story 102. A time of immense academic stress that many experience debt for, but at least I will end it with a nice degree to live in the real world. Story 103. Teetering the thin line between childhood and adulthood. Still naive, still innocent, but hoping to work things out. Story 104. I am unmarried and I have almost reached the age where I will celebrate the same birthday for the rest of my life. Story 105. I would just send people this. Story 106. I am at the age where I can be both a sugar mommy and a sugar baby at the same time. Story 107. Waking up in the morning leads to the following self-commentary. Snap, crackle, pop. Oh no, here we go again. Story 108. There is something called the Chinese zodiac sign, but I guess foreigners do not understand it. Story 109. I am old enough that young people dislike me and young enough that older people dislike me. Story 110. Still young enough to party and do active things. I just need to warm up extensively first. Story 111. I doubt we would be in a position to describe things if numbers did not exist. Story 112. Young enough to remember what it feels like to not have daily aches and pains but currently experiences daily aches and pains. Story 113. Many years ago, at the beginning of Richard Nixon's deceit, I was born. Story 114. Too young to rush things and too old to waste time. Story 115. Infant, child, teenager, young adult, middle-aged adult, senior adult, elderly. Begin with these terms and adjust as needed. Story 116. There are two parts to this question. First, to describe my current age without using numbers. I would say I am a little late to get married, but I have not done it yet. Second, if numbers did not exist, I would not be counting my age in the first place. Based purely on my feelings, I still feel pretty young, just a little bit older than recent graduates. Story 117. Everything hurts. Those younger than me believe I am old enough for this to be true. Those older than me say I am way too young for this to be true. Story 118. Older adults say I'm young, and younger adults say I'm old. What age am I? Story 119. I calculate my age using the Ed Asner Age Index. I am older than he was in the first season of the Mary Tyler Moore Show, when he had just turned 41. However, I look much younger. So even when I am 65, if I still look younger than 40-year-old Ed Asner, which is a distinct possibility, in my head I would be about 36. Story 120. I'm at that point where you begin to gain weight and everything hurts, but you can't be bothered to care. Story 121. I first learned what a social worker was from seeing Lilo and Stitch when it came out in theaters. Story 122. Old enough to remember the good times, young enough to fear the future. Story 123. I was born. The Earth circled the Sun. M***S**H aired its series finale. Story 124. All of my Facebook and high school friends are sharing pictures of their babies and ultrasounds, but my husband and I are not quite there yet. Story 125. Old enough to remember free school milk, but not old enough to retire. Story 126. I am old enough to have adult children but not old enough for grandchildren yet. Story 127. My mom always said she was as old as the hills when we asked her. Story 128. I'm in my adolescent deluxe era. All the privileges and exhaustion of an adult, and all the indecisiveness, uncertainty, and development of adolescence. Story 129. My mind says I can do something, but my body says no way. Story 130. Young but has the body of a 50-year-old. I am way too young to have back pain. Story 131. I started my adolescent years around the year 2000. Story 132. I remember when the computer screamed at us when we tried to get on the internet. I am trying to imagine an internet not made by numbers. Story 133. I am very young, but my back, neck, shoulders, and legs ache when I stand up too early, throw a ball, or even breathe. Story 134. 32. Nobody said anything about words. Story 135. I had my first kiss before mobile phones and the internet existed. Story 136. I have seen the moon go full and wane until silver wove through my dark mane. Story 137. I am old enough to be bothered by the next generation but too young to know what I am doing. Story 138. I was sure my Beanie Baby collection would finance 4 years of college. Story 139. If numbers did not exist, age would also not exist. Numbers make age common sense. Story 140. Old enough to remember drinking from a garden hose. Young enough to know how to use a computer. Story 141. Alf, Jim Henson Muppet Hour, Nintendo Entertainment System, out of this world, small wonder. Story 142. At the age when you panic because everyone else your age has a house, car, partner, children, and all you have is an equally unlucky cat, debts, and back pain. Story 143. I'm from an era where parachute pants and leg warmers were popular. Story 144. I had NSYNC on my wall in kindergarten, Orlando Bloom on my wall at the end of elementary school, and Green Day on my wall in middle and high school. Story 145. Old enough to remember the world before the internet but young enough to know that as much as I think, I will feel my age now. In 10 years it will be much worse. Story 146. Reach the peak of the mountain and go down the other side now. Story 147. Young adult on the verge of full adulthood, enjoying the benefits of being a legal adult, yet I still feel like an elderly person. Story 148. I remember getting the Atari 2600 for Christmas. I remember getting Stretch Armstrong and Stretch Monster also. Story 149. Tired and cynical. Edit. When I was still a child, I was really upset that we were not allowed to play in the sandbox anymore because of the Chernobyl disaster. Story 150. The older you get, the more gray hair appears. I show no gray hair, and my features are those of a young man who just left college. Story 151. They would probably say I am in my prime, but I am chronically ill. Story 152. My husband said dial-up noises. I said Blue's Clues male song. Story 153. I have opinions, but I am too young to be taken seriously. Story 154. The biggest event around my birth was the September 11th attacks. I would simply say, I was born not too long before those planes hit the Twin Towers. Story 155. Many winters ago, leaded gasoline was still used when I was born. Story 156. Old enough to buy a house, but in this economy, I cannot afford it. Story 157. A little over half of everyone thinks I am young. A little under half of people think I am old. I am starting to realize I will be old by my standards soon. Story 158. Past the days of running, but I still have a sprint in me. Story 159. Let us just say I ran out of care to give in the mid-2010s. Story 160. Old enough to dress comfortably and not care what anyone else thinks. Story 161. I remember watching the Twin Towers fall on live television. Alternatively, I remember when William Jefferson Clinton was president. Or, perhaps more accurately, I was alive when the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics dissolved. Story 162. I remember the Tylenol murders, gas shortage, a wall came down, and the end of the Soviet Union. Story 163. Old as dirt. Babysat Noah. Had dinosaurs as childhood pets. Story 164. 2 months younger than September 11th. I say it to older coworkers for the shock factor. Story 165. I'm old enough to remember when unlimited phone plans were not really available and you had to buy minutes. Story 166. Finished university, experienced several mental breakdowns, and now I am deliberating whether I should continue dating or just have a baby with a couple. Story 167. Bill Burr saying we are in the drop-dead years is accurate. Story 168. Grew up with a PlayStation 2, Nintendo DS, Nintendo Wii, Xbox 360, Nintendo 3DS, and Xbox One in that order. All were the consoles of the day. Bought a Nintendo Switch in the launch year after mowing my neighbor's lawn for the summer in high school. That narrows it down to a handful of years. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.